Hey there, lady lads and gentle lads. My name is Smastian, and I present you with Richard Nixon's take on World War II. The joke is he played a lot of cards during the war. More so than doing any actual fighting, what with being a logistics officer. Either way. Game I'm reviewing today is Kards. Yes, literally Kards, with a K. No, I'm not screwing with you, we're reviewing Kards. A collectible card game made by 1939 Games, an Icelandic indie studio consisting of former CCP devs of EVE Online fame. They've been working on this game for the past 5 years, and I only found out about it a week or so ago, after it left early access, and I've already lost 70 hours of my life to it, trying to put out a fair and balanced review, which has nothing to do with my gambling addiction, I swear. I'll be dividing the video into rough sections to make it easier to watch, and I'll be leaving the timestamps in the description below. Anyway, since the rule sets for CCGs tend to be quite important, I'll be spending a fair chunk of time talking about those now, so feel free to skip ahead if you're already familiar with how these games work. That said, if you want to refamiliarize yourself with the mechanics, or get more familiar with the ones that exist in this game, stick around. And with that warning out of the way, and with all three of us here, what sets this game apart from other digital Skinner boxes like Hearthstone? Mechanically, it is, at its core, a deck-building game, so your number one enemy will always be card draw. Which is a fairly shallow take, I know, but it is one that nonetheless bears repeating. Now, having played Hearthstone, I can say with some certainty that this game does shake up the mechanics of card games enough to be a compelling experience. On a basic level, your cards have mana costs. In this case, they're called credits, again with a K. You select a starting hand during your mulligan round, you play your cards sequentially on your turn, paying mana as you go, and you want to smack your opponent's life points, that is to say their headquarters, this time not with a K, all the way down to 0. You have 4 unit types to choose from: infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft. Beyond that, you also have your quote-unquote spell cards, which are called orders, and which range from direct damage burn, to traps, to buffs, etc. All in all, fairly simple stuff. Things start to get interesting when we consider the central gimmick of the game, the front line. In order to deal damage to your enemy's HQ, you must first advance your units into the front line, or overcome it by other means. Moving into the front line consumes a unit's action for the turn, and these are refreshed at the beginning of next turn. What this entails from a gameplay perspective is that any unit may be turned into a guard unit that blocks access to your HQ. This is of course offset by the various unit types. Infantry are your milquetoast sort of melee unit. They function exactly as you would think. They have 1 action per turn. They either move into the front line or they attack. Armor, i.e. tanks, have 2 actions. They can move into the front line and attack within the same turn. Aircraft are your flyer-type units. Shocker, I know. They can ignore the front line entirely and attack units and the enemy HQ directly in the support line. Artillery are similar to aircraft in that they too can ignore the front line entirely, though their major advantage is that enemies attacked by artillery do not get to retaliate against the artillery. In terms of movement and attack actions, aircraft and artillery follow the same attack movement logic as infantry, in that they can only do one or the other in a turn. Lastly, on the note of unit actions, units not only have a deployment cost, and must be placed to the support line, they also have an activation cost once placed on the board. As a result, mana management gains an additional layer of nuance. The conjunction of the front line and unit activation cost mechanics does a number of things for game balance. Most obviously, it impedes the progress of rushdown decks without necessarily removing them as a viable meta option. We'll get back to this later. More subtly, it allows for several counterplay and deck building options. To note, the game's mana system functions like Hearthstone's, in that you passively accumulate additional mana points until you hit the game's mana cap. In this case, 12 points. Ramp cards can allow you to permanently go over this limit, though this can only occur if you played those cards after reaching the mana cap. Lastly, on this note, there is no coin card for player 2. they instead get to choose one additional card during the mulligan phase, which is compounded by the fact that player 1 does not draw an additional card on the first turn. We'll get back to this later as well. The major drawback of this mana system, in Hearthstone especially, is that in order to maintain effective board presence, one must always be playing on curve. For the uninitiated, or the more rational and restrained of us, this means that you are always playing a 1-cost card on turn 1, a 2-cost card on turn 2, a 3-cost card on turn 3, and so on. If you aren't able to play cards that allow you to develop a board presence, or a combo setup in this manner, you will typically be playing at a disadvantage. With the additions of unit activation costs and the Frontline, however, you are still able to develop the board state without necessarily playing cards on curve, as they both draw from the same mana pool. Control of the Frontline is important for a number of reasons. First, as mentioned, it functions as a guard against melee units rushing directly for your HQ, rather than forcing you to rely on necessarily drawing unit cards with a guard effect. Second, it allows you to suppress your enemy into their support line, which has a maximum capacity of 4 units, because the HQ takes up slot 5. It also takes up a slot in your deck, by the way. And, I feel I should mention, the Frontline has a full capacity of 5 units. Third, there are spell cards and effects that target the front line or the support line exclusively, so positioning your units to avoid or land those spells or effects is quite important. Lastly, and most subtly, this allows free-to-play players to remain competitive without forcing them to have access to hyper-rare cards stacked with busted effects. Since you have the additional breathing room afforded by the front line, you can put together an effective counterplay with many of the starting cards at your disposal. And would you look at that, another thing we'll be touching upon again later. There are, however, some downsides to owning the front line. For one, your opponent does not have to spend as much mana to remove your units off of the board, as they are right beside their support line. For two, there is the enforced incentive to move your units into the front line so that you may deploy more units. Say your backline is filled with artillery units, and you need to clear space to put down a guard unit, but the enemy controls the front line? If you'll remember, the artillery's attacks won't draw any retaliation, so they will be stuck in position. For 3, there are the spells/effects that only target the front line. They encumber your deck with a very situational card, and drawing such a card when its conditions cannot be met potentially spell disaster for your board state. Pun absolutely intended. And for 4, God, that sounds weird. Anyway, forcing the enemy to come to you can be of benefit, as it forces them to waste mana on movement rather than on developing their board with more units or activating spells. Turning our attentions towards deck building, there are some comparisons I'd like to draw against Hearthstone. For starters, you have a deck of 40 cards at your disposal, as opposed to Hearthstone's 30. As mentioned, the HQ is one of them, so functionally you're building a deck out of 39 cards. Now, where Hearthstone allows you to take 2 duplicates of any rarity of card, save for elite cards of which you can only have 1, this game lets you take 4 duplicates of a common, 3 duplicates of an uncommon, 2 duplicates of a rare, and 1 duplicate of an elite card. Already, some of you may see what this entails for the free-to-play side of things. Now, when dealing with an opening hand, Player 1 mulligans 4 cards and draws no extra on turn 1. Player 2 mulligans 5 and draws an additional card when the first turn passes to them. What this means is that you are no longer as reliant on the mulligan phase to draw you a perfect curve to play against your opponent, nor are you as reliant on making the perfectly curved deck in order to play against any kind of opponent. This, along with the frontline mechanic, which I explained in the previous section, and which you should probably go back and watch if you've skipped it, are the most critical mechanics that enable this to be a competitive game for free-to-players. Hearthstone's major weakness is its extreme barrier to entry for new and budget-conscious players. Since the meta decks are so powerful, the only way to not get curb stomped is to lob a wad of cash at Blizzard. I mean, there's additional problems with Blizzard's card design that factor into why Hearthstone is such a casino fiesta, and thankfully, so far, I've seen little to none of those problems here in Cards. The most RNG that you will be dealing with is largely down to the card draw, and I mean, that's true really of any card game out there. Anyway, in Cards, putting together a deck that can reliably pull good common cards, thanks to the breathing room afforded to you by being able to take 4 duplicates of a common, makes so many aspects of the metagame that much easier. Not only does it make building the deck easier, it makes counterplaying other decks easier. It's a step in the right direction, as I see it. Furthermore, there isn't as much of a reliance on elite units thanks to this system. They are insanely good if you can get your hands on them, but they aren't a critical necessity to make even a free-to-play deck viable. Naturally, however, it goes without saying that someone who slings $200 to $300 at a game like this is going to be able to put together a monster deck merely by virtue of their financial corpulence. That said, those folk are few and far between, and so long as you play well, it isn't impossible to overcome them. They do make it heckin' difficult, though. Bloody hell, I haven't even talked about the factions yet. So, when putting together a deck, you have a choice of 5 main factions: Soviet, British, German, United States, or Japan. The Soviets are like a warlock archetype from Hearthstone. They have some low-cost units with high attack and low health that deal damage to your HQ upon deployment. Some token generation, and some really powerful high-cost units with nutty effects. The Brits are basically a stall faction. Many units have low damage but high health. A lot of them come with a guard effect, and are quite reliant on spells to turn their lumbering 2/6 units into 20/20 behemoths. They also have some insane aircraft. The Germans, meanwhile, are a mix of rush and control with some nutty big units. Their low-cost stuff leans towards the rush end, whereas the bigger units have more control effects. The United States are most closely akin to a ramp faction, so they have some scary big units, one of which costs 15 mana, and some insane board buffs that are reliant on frontline control. What's more, they have one of the most insane hand reloads in the game, but I'll let you guys find out about that one. Lastly, the Japanese are almost exclusively a rush faction with a bit of control thrown in. The distinctions tend not to matter very much, as you are allowed to throw in up to 12 cards from one of the other nations into your deck. You want to do a rush focus? Throw some German units in with the Japanese. Are you having trouble with board clearing as the British? Throw some Soviet burn in there. Want to run a mono United States deck? You absolutely can. All of this has the added benefit of keeping the factions from growing into stagnant one-trick ponies. One more thing to note is that you may take only the elite cards from your main faction when building a deck. There is no elite double dipping from your allied faction. In spite of that, I've seen some inventive stuff, and most of it isn't even pay to win. With that out of the way, how easy is it to unlock new cards? A new pack costs 10 gold. You can earn them in the typical manner, the win 3 games, get a coin sort of way, 2 coins for the first win of the day, and you get 3 free packs once you activate your account. Additionally, there is a robust system of achievements that routinely dumps 5 gold or a pack or a new random card your way, sometimes even crafting materials for new cards. Most of these are tied to factions, the achievements that is. Some of them are universal, all of them require you to pay only minimal amounts of attention to the game, and many of them revolve around playing X amount of card type Y, playing X amount of faction Y's cards, dealing X amount of damage to Y-type unit, and so on and so on. To unlock the achievements, you must play PvP. That said, there are also daily challenges, and those can be completed in the training mode against the AI. Now, if you save up 15 coins, you can also try your hand at the draft mode. The more matches you win, with a draft deck, the more rewards you get. 3 strikes, and you're out. Depending on preference and/or skill, this may be a more efficient way for you to earn card packs. Even if you lose all 3 matches with no wins, you'll get a card pack and a random card, which is pretty fair, I think. Of note, when drafting, you are presented with 3 card choices. Interestingly, those card choices sometimes offer you multiples of the same card, up to 4 times 1 common card. So crafting a draft deck around a specific playstyle isn't as onerous as it is in Hearthstone, which, over there, it absolutely is a casino. The last way to earn new cards is through the PvP ranked season. A season lasts for a whole month, and you are rewarded with gold and card packs once it ends. The rankings are split up by faction, and in order to achieve the equivalent of Hearthstone's Legend rank, the Officers Club, you need to reach max rank with 3 out of the 5 factions. There are 6 ranks per faction. Once you achieve a rank, you can't fall back to the rank below it. You can only lose progress within the rank you're currently in, and it takes 5 stars to complete a rank. You get a star for every win, 2 if you keep a win streak going, and every rank you achieve grants you a reward at the end of the season. Reaching max rank grants a full pack of cards exclusive to that nation to you. And depending on your placement in the Officers Club, one assumes that one can get better rewards, but merely entering the Officers Club grants you a multinational card pack and a bonus card, from what I've seen. All in all, the ranking system disincentivizes the hunt for the perfect meta deck by enforcing experimentation onto the player. You're given a chance to familiarize yourself with each faction and its playstyle, instead of trying to do a quick internet search for the deck that plays itself. Now that I've finished prattling on about the game's mechanics, deck building, and card unlocks, let's talk about the state of the meta and the health of the community. According to Steam charts, concurrent player numbers are bouncing between 1,000 and 2,000 players in accordance with the time of day. It would seem that peak hours occur between 5 AM and 11 AM Pacific Standard Time, and meta-wise, there isn't a terribly stable one from what I've seen so far. Rush mechanics are fairly important, as they allow units to more easily ford the gap between the support and front lines, but dedicated low-cost rush decks tend to struggle with consistency, as it's fairly easy to stall them out once you rob them of frontline access. So many of them are now incorporating bigger units that can help their longevity and potency in the mid and late game phases. One would assume then that there is a prevalence of dedicated stall decks that are meant to counter this rush style, thus explaining the rush decks gearing away from a turn 5 beatdown. This isn't the case, however, as most mid-range decks tend to outperform the stall decks, which tend to rely on low damage, high health units. Consistency holds them back equally as often. Token decks are a rarity. OTK combo decks, that's one turn kill for the rest of you, even more so. Though I was on the receiving end of one, and it was almost poetically frustrating to deal with. In terms of mana curves, the range tends to go no higher than 6 cost cards, due largely to the costs of unit activation, though folk have begun throwing in sprinklings of 7 to 10 cost cards to give themselves late game recovery options or kill potential. Within the week or so that I've been playing, I've seen the already loose meta shift several times. In spite of that, I was able to reach max rank in 4 nations using only free-to-play decks and whatever boons that came my way in card packs. I did receive exactly 2 elite cards, one for the United States and one for the Soviet factions, but I was at that point already in the general rank, which is the last one, for both of these nations, so these cards weren't terribly pivotal to my success, though they helped expedite the home stretch. Matchmaking-wise, there seems to be some background ranking system that classifies you according to a global win rate, and it seems to try to match you with players that are roughly at your skill level. I'm not sure about this, but it strikes me as accurate, as even in the lowest rankings of other factions, I was getting matched against opponents with stronger decks, which I believe was taking my prior performance with other decks into account. As a final note about the game's health, I should point out that the game does occasionally suffer from card effect bugs. It's hard to judge how prevalent they are, but I'll just pull a number out of my ass and say that it happens 1 in every 40 games. It's not terribly common. You'll be relying on a card effect to activate, and it sometimes simply won't, or it won't activate in full, and you'll bloody hate it when it happens. That said, anyone who has played Hearthstone is no stranger to glitchy bullshit. So then, final observations. Community, stable. Meta, fluid. Matchmaking, presumably fair, glitches, intermittent, and more or less infrequent. So, what does the future hold for this game? Or, put another way, how long can the devs keep this ball and chain rolling? The current roadmap seems to be the addition of some sort of historical campaigns game mode, which will likely function like the adventures in Hearthstone if I had to wager. They are also looking to add more factions to the game. So far, they have added France and Italy as allied nations that you can choose when building a deck, though their cards are locked behind a second set of card packs, and they do not start off with any cards unlocked as starters. That said, you can get 1 or 2 cards very rarely from the default card pack. Don't rely on it though. You'll just have to save up gold to farm out these card packs and their attendant mechanics, or you'll have to shell out some real dosh to build decks that successfully integrate these factions. Either way, caveat emptor. Not many people tend to run them in the standard PvP mode anyway, though the ones that do tend towards the pay-to-win end of the spectrum. France is built around mill mechanics as well as a mobilization mechanic that buffs affected units by +1/+1 at the start of every turn until that unit takes damage. Italy is an odd faction, and I'll freely admit that I have no idea what their central gimmicks are, because I couldn't be arsed to look at any of their cards. Largely because so few people run Italian cards in their decks, from what I've seen. Other planned factions include Canada, Finland, China, Poland, and apparently many more. It is unclear if these will permanently remain as ally-only factions, or if they will eventually gain faction status as main factions in the future. I don't know. All that I've pointed out so far has been confirmed by the developers. If you'll indulge me, however, I will dive into some random speculation about where I think this game is headed. So I'm gonna date the video by saying that coronavirus is a thing right now, and folk are pretty worried about their money right now. I feel compelled to bring this up because one must wonder if this outbreak has negatively impacted the release of the game. Since the financial model hinges on the purchasing of card packs in order to sustain itself, I can't help but think that this is a bad time to be making money on a game like this. Though I may well be wrong about that. People may be more than willing to spend money on games like this, out of some need to distract themselves from their sudden joblessness. Sorry if that hits too close to home for any of you. I mean, I've been there. I'm almost there. Anyway, conversely, this might be a weird sort of boon for the free-to-play crowd, as there will be less people spending money on super busted decks. There will be a far lesser pressure on people to pump money into making meta decks in an effort to remain competitive with the pay-to-win crowd as a result. What I'm getting at is that we may have a strange lull in the game's meta because people aren't spending as much money as they otherwise would on digital card games. Moving away from wild-ass speculation over to more reasonable speculation, there's a significant chance that this game will turn out exactly like Hearthstone depending on how they try to keep the game fresh with new mechanics in the upcoming expansion packs or sets. Many people in the Hearthstone community point to the Karazhan expansion as the one where a lot of the casino tier card generation garbage started creeping its way in to upset the game's already tenuous balance, and Firelands Portal was perhaps the most busted card from that entire adventure set. It was a 7-cost card that dealt 5 damage to a target of your choice, and spawned a random 5-cost minion besides. Effectively, this was like dealing 17 damage to your opponent, since most 5-cost minions in that game have a 12-point potential split between their attack, their HP, and their card effect, which your opponent must now figure out a way to remove so that it won't be able to take advantage of its full potential. In the end, someone facing off against a Firelands Portal got to deal with 2 problems for the mana cost of 1. What's more, you could have 2 of them in your deck. Anyway, to cock the game up to this extent would require roughly 3 sets worth of content, I wager. About as much time as it took to bring out the Karazhan expansion. So make of that what you will. On the topic of sets, potential other avenues the devs could explore is the extension of the game's time frame into the post-war era. As we already have a number of late war cards, there might be some expansion sets that fill out the late war feel a bit more. That said, I would expect something akin to a War Thunder sort of scenario, where we now find ourselves slinging M1 Abrams against each other, against equally obscene modern armor like the Merkava. Anyway, one would assume that they would try to cycle out the older sets into some sort of wild or legacy game mode to prevent power creep from impacting the old cards too much. Perhaps the game would even split into eras focused on the past major wars, like World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, World War I maybe even, etc. In a case like this, however, the player base would more than likely get split fairly heavily, and with a 2,000 peak of concurrent players, I would imagine that to be a rather foolhardy decision. The game could also be an altogether focused affair. Rather than trying to milk the game for longevity, the developers might already have a limited scope of planned content that might not extend past 2 or 3 core sets. This would be what I would call the best case scenario. The game will get to avoid all the drawbacks of needing to stay fresh with each new update, though it would quickly get hyper-optimized to such a point that new players won't even be able to get a foot in the door. I mean, there's worse things than having a game with a 3-year multiplayer life cycle, and the devs ought to be able to make a tidy sum in that time frame. Dialing back to the note of keeping the game fresh, one of the concerns I would have, were I a developer, is that there isn't enough incentive for folk to come back every week to play the game. This is my ham-fisted way of wondering why the game doesn't have some sort of weekly challenge mode that offers a gold or card pack reward for successful completion. Basically, why doesn't this game have some sort of low-stakes equivalent of a tavern brawl mode? Part of the reason why people keep coming back to Hearthstone is often to have some fun in that free-to-play mode. After all, it helps them facilitate further free play. From a more cynical perspective, it also helps rope people into dropping more money your way. But what do I know? In all fairness, the devs have no doubt thought of this already, and there is some valid reason for why they haven't implemented it yet, so I will, retract my criticism slightly. Another way to incentivize player engagement, in my estimation, would be a head-to-head private drafts mode. It wouldn't leave you any rewards, but it would certainly make the game more viable as a casual game to play for shits and giggles with your friends. The likelihood that it would detract from the ranked player base is also pretty low, as ladder humpers like myself are always going to want to scratch that competitive itch. At the end of the day, Cards is a card game where you play cards to get the chance to play different cards in the hopes that it will allow you to play more cards with better cards that will allow you to win at cards so that you can get all the cards to play any cards out of all of the cards you own so that you can show other cards players how good you are at playing cards. And it sure as shit ain't Hearthstone, and goddamn if that isn't the best praise there is for a collectible card game. Now, if you manage to sit through all 4,000 plus words of this review, and are somehow bloody interested in playing this game with me, I'll be leaving my username in the description below. Hit me up with an invite and a challenge if you see me online. Going forward, I'll likely be streaming this game on some sort of weekly basis, though I don't know what my work life is going to be like when this whole Corona business clears up. I'll be making an effort to do a Sunday or a Monday stream around noon Pacific Standard Time for a few hours, as those days are likely going to be my days off. In the end, I would rate this game as a fairly solid 7 out of 10. The gameplay loop is pretty catchy, and you can leave the award for Understatement of the Year at my doorstep. You can get some neat history blurbs about the cards. It feels good to win. It sucks when you can't draw the perfect cards, but your opponent can. And it bloody well isn't for everyone. You need to be a specific breed of impulsive to enjoy games like this, and most folks simply aren't. Turns out, I'm one of the former. So here we are, finally at the end. I'd just like to quickly say thanks for listening to me waffle on about some niche card game for however long this video ends up being. Next up, I'll finally be reviewing Mech Merc Company, as it has officially entered early access. And I did mention some months ago that this would be a thing I was going to do. Took me bloody long enough, no? Either way, I've been Smastian, I'll see you on the battlefield, and I hope you all have a damn good day.